Appropriately, our first video in this series is Passive House 101. It's presented by board members Josh Salinger and Beth Campbell, who have given this many times in the past to audiences of all different sizes. Obviously, this is a great first-timers video if you're just getting into Passive House, but it also is a fantastic refresher video for those who have been around for a while, because it's got a lot of historical background information and lays out a really good idea of how we got to this place in our building community. Something for everyone. Enjoy. A special thank you to the sponsors of this particular video: Small Planet Supply, Passive House Accelerator, Fenster Windows and Doors, O'Brien 360, TK1SC.
Hi everybody, I'm Beth Campbell, and this is Josh Salinger, and we are here today representing Passive House Northwest. Thanks everybody. We're sorry about the conference needing to be canceled. Hopefully everybody is understanding about that, and we're doing our best to go ahead and send you all some good content today. So Josh and I are doing a Passive House 101. It's going to cover the basics. When we do this presentation, we often say that we have audience members who both know nothing about Passive House or high performance construction, all the way up to builders who are and architects, engineers, everybody who's quite knowledgeable. So if you do have questions, please send them in. We've got a little relay system. Hopefully we should be able to answer your questions by the end, if not during the presentation. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Josh is the founder and CEO of Bird's Mouth Construction, and I am a project manager here with Green Hammer Construction.
With that, I'm going to jump off the screen, and Beth is going to take over for a little while. We're just kind of going to go back and forth at various points. So with that, we'll let Beth take it away.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Josh. So what is Passive House? Passive House is the most energy efficient building certification that we have in the world currently. You're probably familiar with other types of building certifications that are out there, and Passive House is the one that right now is the leader in the world. And so we are looking at a couple of projects that were completed that are, we'll be getting into the details during this presentation of some of the things that we're looking for in Passive House. But for now, we're just going to run through a few slides basically describing what Passive House is. So one of the most key points to bring up about Passive House is that it's performance-based, not prescriptive. So many of you are probably familiar with prescriptive certifications such as LEED, where maybe you need to hit a certain number of points in order to receive your certification. But because Passive House is performance-based, we're actually looking at the performance of the house. So for number one, the project has to be modeled before it is built. And one thing I think I want to mention before I get too far down this road too is that the name Passive House is a little bit of a misnomer. Really, you can do any type of building, whether it be commercial, residential, private sector, it can be public sector, anything can fit in the name. But the main point is that it needs to be computer modeled and actually show results in order to be certified. We've got a little video here for you that does a really nice job of describing what Passive House is.
Passive House explained in 90 seconds. Does your house have a heater in the basement or maybe a fireplace? Probably also a central air conditioner or maybe a window unit. Did you ever wonder if it was necessary? In 1991, a physicist in Austria, Dr. Feist, built the first passive house. Here's what he did. 1. Proper insulation. It's just like wearing the right winter jacket, it also doesn't need a heater. 2. No air leakages. There should be no holes, small or large, to let hot air out of the house. 3. No thermal bridges. A thermal bridge is like a road for heating energy in which warmth can travel right through your walls. As a matter of fact, most of our houses have thermal highways in our walls where heat can easily travel to the outside. Plus, the house needs proper windows most of the time with triple pane glass. It needs to be oriented properly so the sun can heat it in the winter and shade is provided in the summer. And it uses an HRV, a device that provides the inside with fresh air without letting the heat out. Add all these things up And it turns out your house doesn't need a heater or air conditioner. So where does the heat come from? A passive house needs 90% less energy, and that can easily be supplied by your body heat, the sun, your appliances, light bulbs, and even your TV. This saves you a lot of money on your heating bill and helps preserve the environment. Did we make it in 90 seconds?
You bet we did.
Okay, great. As I just mentioned, Passive House can work with any type of building, any vernacular. It doesn't have to look like a building from the 1960s or 70s. So you can see in this slide, we've got some residential multifamily going on. We have an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. On the top right, we've got a big dorm building that was created in New York City. So we really can work with any type of building vernacular, any size. And one thing that we want to be clear about, again, the name Passive House is a little bit unfortunate because we are not describing passive solar. Passive solar was created in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. And in this slide, you can see a couple of those buildings, which were really inventive at the time. They were really working on capturing the sun's energy, but resulted in a lot of overheating. Regardless, we can work with any building vernacular that's popular today. We don't need to guess at the performance of a building. Everything is computer modeled ahead of time and energy modeled, and therefore we know, within a good degree of certainty how the building is going to perform once it's constructed. And now we're jumping to you. Yeah?
I think so.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Beth, for that. We're just going to be switching off back and forth every so often on this. So every so often, or with all these different slide presentations, I think it's worth looking at this slide just because I think it's really important to point out that we're facing a crisis with climate change, and one of the biggest contributors to climate change is our buildings. And as you can see from this slide here, that 39% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States come from our buildings. And it used to be that we could say that was more than industry and transportation combined. But what's actually happened is that because our buildings have been getting a little more efficient, that orange little wedge of the pie there has been shrinking. So now it's a good thing that we are making our industry is getting more efficient. So, but I can no longer say that our industry uses more energy or contributes more greenhouse gas emissions in the United States than industry and transportation combined. But nevertheless, if we're really trying to make a difference in our fight against climate change, buildings are probably the biggest. They are the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So Passive House is one of the best ways to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in our buildings through the use of the envelope. This next slide, I think, is really fascinating too. And what this is showing is you can see where we're at right now in 2020. We're a little bit higher than we are in 2018, where the dashed line is. But global building stock is supposed to double by the year 2060. So this is kind of a dual-prong approach between addressing the existing built environment, and Passive House can be used in retrofits in addressing the built environment, but it's also about new building. So I think they're equally important. As you can see from this graph here, that by 2060, if you follow that line over, we're actually going to double. So at the bottom there, you can see that kind of remarkable sentence that says, like, a city the size of New York is being built every 35 days on planet Earth. So I think it's imperative that we start making our buildings more efficient, and Passive House is probably the best way to deal with the energy usage in buildings. So this is why we're doing what we're doing and why it's so important. So we're going to talk about a little bit what I said is, Passive House is the best path to net zero energy. So what this slide, I think, is kind of in a funny way showing that, yeah, we could put enough solar panels on any house to offset it to zero, but not every house has that kind of solar exposure, nor does it have that much roof space, nor is that necessarily the most cost-effective way to go about doing things. And what I could say about this house, too, is that it's possible that this is a very uncomfortable, it's a leaky home. It might have issues with mold and poor indoor air quality. Passive House not only reduces the amount of energy needed through reductions of the energy usage by the envelope, but it also has all these kind of win-win-win things that come out of it, such as you get a much higher indoor air quality inside the building. We'll get into that later on in the presentation. It's much more comfortable. It's not going to be drafty. It's not going to be cold. The back bedroom of the house isn't going to be freezing, whereas the living room has got like the ducted forced air heat coming at you, and you're just too hot there. So not only are we creating buildings that are using less energy, but they're also more comfortable, healthier, last longer, they're more durable, and also are more resilient. So it really is a win-win-win that comes out of this. So as I mentioned earlier, Passive House deals with these issues via energy conservation within the building's envelope. So you can see here a couple projects kind of showing, on the right, there's a Sega MyVest product on a building that is essentially the air barrier that's keeping all of that energy in. If you think of a balloon, you want to make sure you keep all that warm air in. You don't want to have leaks letting it out. And on the left, you can see some cork insulation, which is an interesting product. Also deals with the embodied energy of materials, which Passive House actually does not address. Passive House is really focused on the energy conservation, health, indoor air quality, durability, all those kinds of things. But most Passive House practitioners are also understanding the importance of embodied energy of the materials that they use in their buildings. And so there's no reason you can't do both. And the building on the left is something that our company built a few years back, where we used a cork insulation on a certified Passive House. And that's kind of the sweater that you're wearing over that building. So if you think of the thing on the right as your air barrier being kind of like the parka, that kind of windbreaker that you're wearing, and you think of the one on the left as being kind of a sweater. If you're wearing just a sweater, you get that cold air still hitting you, but if you wear a sweater with a parka over the top of it and you break the wind, suddenly it's really comfortable. So same goes with our buildings, and that's kind of what this is showing. So I kind of touched on this a little bit before. I guess I was getting ahead of myself, but it is a win-win situation. They are more comfortable. They are quiet, which is really an interesting thing. Just a couple days ago, I was in a building where we were playing with the windows, and it was a leaf blower outside or something loud. I forget exactly what it was, but you could really open and close the window and see how quiet it is, which is really remarkable. And another interesting story that I've got, I was sitting on a panel once a few years back with a woman who was head of Reach Development, and they did the orchards at Orenco project in Hillsboro, Oregon, which was a Passive House certified multifamily project for people that live, I think it was 80% medium family income. And someone in the audience asked, what is the most feedback and most interesting feedback that you get from the residents of this building? And I was expecting someone to say, well, it's comfortable and my energy bills are low, which is likely true. But what they said was that they love how quiet it was because it made them feel secure and safe, which is interesting because if you think about a lot of these frontline communities and stuff like that, they're often living next to industry or freeways, noise, all that kind of stuff that with just having that quietness just made them feel secure and comfortable. And that's a fascinating thing that hadn't occurred to me that you also get as a win-win from Passive House, is how quiet these things are. Again, higher indoor air quality. We'll get into how that works later on. They're healthy buildings. They don't allow for condensation, which then promotes mold growth and things like that, and spores and all the nasty stuff that might come from a typical house's crawl space, things like that. Again, we'll get into it later. And they last longer. I had heard a stat, and I've been looking for this for a few years, but the average lifespan of a new home built in the United States is 25 years before a new system has to be completely installed, whether that's a complete new HVAC system, new siding, new windows, all that kind of stuff. Whereas Passive Houses, I've heard stories that they're 200-year homes. And so it seems to me that 25 years is a little quick and maybe 200 is a little long, but point being is that these buildings last a lot longer and they can be passed along from generation to generation. And they're really kind of the apex of what humanity has been able to figure out in regards to our buildings to this point. So with Passive House, you can see with this slide here, on the left and the red, you've got a leaky home, and on the right, you've got a Passive House, and you can see how much, just a fraction of the energy usage that it's using. So Passive Houses consume 86% percent less energy for heating and 46% less energy for cooling. Clearly, this depends if you are in Alaska or if you're in San Diego. Clearly, in San Diego, where it's perfectly warm all the time and perfectly tempered, you're going to use much less energy than you would in Fairbanks. But I think this is just a good kind of example of how much less energy a passive house uses. And again, some of the goals of passive house is to reduce energy consumption and provide comfort regardless of climate. This is a fascinating project here, Thorsten Schlupp's passive house, and this is in Fairbanks, Alaska. Interesting house. It apparently has, I think, is it 3-foot thick walls? Filled with cellulose insulation, 3 feet thick up in Alaska, but they were able to actually do a zero energy certified passive house in Fairbanks. And you can think about, what it's like in the wintertime there, and you just get no solar. Yeah, and you can see the angle of those solar panels right there, because that sun is really close to that horizon in wintertime, if it even comes up for much more than a couple hours. So it can be done anywhere. So. We're going to get a little bit into passive house history here now. So if we go way back prior to kind of the way that we're building nowadays, all buildings kind of used to be passive. You can see from this example, you've got a bunch of awnings and shades, right? So what they're doing there is just controlling, and it's kind of obvious, right? The sun is coming into the building, it gets hot, there's a lot of glare. What do? You put shades, exterior shades on your building, and that used to be quite common. Made a lot of sense. And so passive house is actually just kind of taking some of these common sense things that we used to do and applying it to current building. And so oftentimes with passive house, you'll see things such as exterior shading, or we'll certainly take that into account in the computer modeling, whether that's the house next door or it's trees, a block away that are shading it or something like that. So, we kind of moved away from that. Buildings used to be site-specific, which passive house is also. So when we're doing the computer model with the passive house, it actually locates where you are exactly, latitude, longitude, where you're at in terms of elevation, or trees that are around you, or if you're getting a lot of sun, those kinds of things. So it's very site-specific. It has to take into account those microclimates of each condition where that house might be built, which if you go way back in time, kind of these vernacular buildings here where all buildings were site-specific. So whether it was a teepee or something built into the side of a cliff, it was responding to its immediate environment, and that's what passive house is doing also. So then along comes heating, air conditioning, all these great mechanical systems that just allow us to be comfortable kind of anywhere, right? You could be in Las Vegas, for instance, and be perfectly comfortable there if you throw enough energy and machines at it that you can actually make yourself comfortable, right? So, man, that's nice. I mean, look at this woman. She is stoked. So everyone starts moving that way, and I think that's understandable, right? And the other thing that happened is we went from buildings that look like this is a typical 1925 bungalow you might find in Portland, Oregon here, to buildings that look like this. So buildings got a lot bigger and a lot more complex. I mean, this thing here essentially is just a little box with a front gable on it, and I don't know how many gables are on this thing or why, but you can see that every time there is a jig or a jog or a corner or a valley or a hip, those are all places where there could be energy losses through thermal bridging or otherwise, or air leakage. So as we start building more and more buildings like this, it just makes it more and more energy inefficient. So, why did this happen? Why didn't we just live better lives in the same small, simple homes that we were accustomed to? Because apparently we wanted to live in things that look like this. So obviously not practical. And then what happened is we kind of hit the energy crisis of the 1970s with the oil embargo, and suddenly gas prices spike, and there's long lines at the gas pump, and people are starting to realize that there's just fuel shortages, right? And we can't necessarily keep on living in these buildings or building buildings like we used to, with all this added, mechanical energy and pump outs, and although we're still building like that. So So this kind of sparked the solar passive movement. And to some of the slides Beth was showing earlier, early on, those were the pioneers. They did a lot of great work by putting some of these greenhouses on the south side of their house, trom walls, thermal mass, all this kind of stuff, trying to figure out ways that we can capture this free energy of the sun. And so from there, people realized that these things weren't necessarily comfortable. It was like living on the moon, right? So it could either be really cold at night because you've just got this glass wall in your house, or it's really hot during the day. It's summertime and it's 3 o'clock and that sun's going through that greenhouse and your whole house is just, it's too hot, So someone started thinking about this, how can we actually make this better? And so Harold Orr did the first super insulated house. So this is continuous thermal insulation. We'll get into that later too, and making it really thick and essentially like a cooler so that you're keeping that energy inside the building. And so this is one of the first houses to do that. And it actually got a blower door 0.8 ACH 50. We'll explain what that means a little bit later, but this is an extremely airtight building. It had a heat recovery ventilation system. Again, this is providing fresh air, and also keeping that energy inside the house and not just bleeding it to the outside. And it had R44 insulation in the walls and 60 in the roof, which incidentally is kind of about where we're building right now in Portland, Oregon, Seattle, and kind of in the Pacific Northwest to hit Passive House. And they were pointing at the sun and holding in the heat. Right now we tend to manage the sun as opposed to just pointing it at the sun. But this was the first house to kind of prove that it could be done. Then we get into the Eugene Ledger House in 1977. And this, if you look back at this house over here, this is a strange looking animal. Not everybody's going to want to live in something like this, and nor is it necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing building in the world. But the Eugene Ledger House kind of took a regular looking 1950s single story ranch and turned it into a passive house. So it's heated only by its own water heater. And doesn't have any of the solar passive features, the large greenhouse on the south-facing side. So it just looked like a regular house and proved that, we really can make these things super energy efficient without looking like crazy, passive solar buildings. This is an interesting slide here. This is a ship back in 1893, and I'll read this because I think it's an interesting little story. But the sides of the ship are lined with tarred felt. Then comes a space with cork padding. We showed a picture of a house with cork on it before. Then is a deal paneling and a thick layer of felt, and then airtight linoleum, and last of all, an inner paneling. The ceiling of the saloon and cabins give a total thickness of about 15 inches. The skylight, which is the most exposed to the cold, is protected by 3 panels of glass. There's that triple pane glass, one within the other, and various other ways. The Fram is a comfortable abode. Whether the thermometer stands at 22 degrees above zero or at 22 below, we have no fire in the stove. The ventilation is excellent, especially since we rigged up the air sail, which sends a whole winter's cold in through the ventilator. Yet in spite of this, we sit here warm and comfortable with only a lamp burning. I'm thinking of having the stove removed altogether. It's only in the way. So again, a lot of this is common sense, and Passive House is really just kind of picking up some of the stuff that's already been done by the people that blazed the path before us, and just applying that to today's buildings. So where are we at here? Almost getting to Beth. Early takeaways from Passive House history, and just in general, I think, is just to keep it simple. Try not to have too many hips and valleys. If you do, try to just make sure you plan for those, and that you are just kind of keeping the air barrier simple, get away from the origami, all that kind of stuff. Simple is better than complicated. Moving parts fail, so a lot of these early systems had a lot of machinery and ventilators and heaters and all this different stuff that was taking salt loops from the heat and putting it into a water tank, which then distributed through manifolds and all this stuff. Let's not do that. One of the great things about Passive House is that you need a very small mechanical system and a very simple one. So we're reducing the amount of moving parts and lessening the failures in these things, making them more resilient. Superb insulation is needed, definitely. We want to make sure that we've got a nice thick sweater on, and then that sweater goes all the way around the entire building. And an airtight envelope is a must. That is the most important thing when it comes to our buildings, is airtightness. I should take that back. It's the second most important thing. The most important thing in our buildings is a roof to keep the rain out. The second most important thing is the air barrier. We'll get into that and why that's so important. And you lose up to 60% of your energy through just air leakage in the building, so it is very important. And you don't need any extra thermal mass. We don't need to have huge trom walls. We don't need to have extra thick slabs or brick on the inside of the building. It's not necessary. Typically, if you have an airtight and thermally insulated house, everything that's in the house, whether it's the table, the flooring, the drywall, the lighting, it's all adding to that thermal mass. It's all at that same temperature, and it's really keeping the house quite consistent. And you don't need a conventional furnace. You can just insert the heat and cooling in one place and let it diffuse. That is a general rule of thumb. There might be some conditions where that might be different. So with that, I think we are going to pass it back to Beth. Here you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Hi again. If you're tuning in, didn't catch the beginning, I'm Beth Campbell. That was Josh Salinger. We're here in Portland, Oregon. And we're just now moving into, looks like we missed one more history slide here, which is showing that even in 1985, they were getting really tuned in. This is a Larson truss in this diagram, showing a little bit more about airtightness, super insulation, how to achieve it. So we got going in the 1980s, kind of lost steam. So what happened? Why didn't it happen? Because the price of oil plummeted. All of a sudden, people thought that we don't actually need to pay so much attention to efficiency. Things are cheap. Hey, let's burn our oil. Sounds great. God bless America. Solar panels got removed from the White House, which I believe they're back up now. But anyway, interesting stuff was happening in the 80s. We really got set back here in the United States. Meanwhile, in Europe, energy was still really expensive. There were a lot of developments happening. They were working on efficiency programs, and we really saw the concepts, the basic concepts around passive house take off in Europe. And there was this gentleman, Wolfgang Feist, who really started developing some of the concepts that laid the groundwork of passive house. He developed passive house in Germany. This is a photo of the first building, so you can see we still have some of that architectural style of kind of that 80s, original solar passive look. As this developed, you can see we've gotten away from that quite a bit, but passive house was born 1990, so we've come a long way in 20 years, and we are moving quickly. Passive house moved to the United States in around 2003. This is Katrine Klingenberg. She was working with Wolfgang Feist in Germany, brought the concepts here, and one thing you'll note is that the little logo of this one represents Passive House Institute. That's an international. And then this logo here that Katrine started, an organization very similar to Passive House Institute called Passive House Institute US. And that's now become also a worldwide organization. At the same time, they're very similar. They have some different principles. But basically, the main point is that we've got two worldwide organizations representing and promoting passive house principles. This is the first passive house that was built in Champaign-Urbana, right here in the Midwest. Not here, that's where I'm from. But in the Midwest, in the United States, things got moving, and we've really taken off from there. So we're going to take the next a little bit of time here really to get into some of the nitty-gritty of what makes, what sets the foundation of a passive house. So this is the kind of general 5 principles that you have to hit in order to achieve passive house. Airtight construction, Josh has already mentioned a little bit about airtight construction. Thermal bridges, heat recovery, ventilation, we're going to go through all of these in depth. High performance windows and doors, and enough insulation to make it work. So again, starting with that idea of the windbreaker and kind of ending with the idea of the warm sweater around a building. So we like to think of Passive House sort of like as an ecosystem, that everything has to interplay, everything has to coalesce and come together to really create a robust building envelope and a robust system that's going to really achieve the energy efficiency goals. And the first one is airtight construction. I know we've already mentioned this a little bit. This is a photo showing that you can do your airtightness layer both on the inside. This is a 475 product that's called Intello. This is a membrane that's used to create airtightness on the inside of a building. We'll show some other slides where you also can have your air barrier on the exterior of the building. But we often have this argument, what's more important here in like our zone in Portland, Oregon, a lot of insulation or air tightness? And a lot of us building geeks kind of come to the determination that air tightness is almost more crucial than insulation in our region because we really see such a reduction in energy loss when you just seal up your building. And of course, we're going to get to ventilation in a minute here because we're not making a house that doesn't breathe, of course. We're going to get a little bit more to that. But one of the main reasons why air tightness is really, really crucial is that with air carries moisture. Air carries moisture. And this is, I think, a really great visual representation showing that diffuse air transfer, like for example, in this case, through a sheet of gypsum board, you're only going to see about 1/3 of a quart of water get transferred through an actual sheet of sheetrock. Whereas if you have a 1-inch by 1-inch hole in a piece of drywall, you can then transport 30 quarts of water. And of course, we are really, really focused on making long-term durability, and water is really what creates mold issues. Water is what destroys durability. So we really want to make sure, one of the reasons why we focus so much on air tightness is to create a durable building. Airtight is really important for comfort in a home. The slide on the left is, of course, an infrared image showing the kind of closet on the right of this 3 image here, and it's showing on the very left one. It's showing that's just a standard infrared photo taken of the heat transfer that's happening within that closet, and then we put a blower door test on it. So all of a sudden we're sucking a bunch of air through the house. You can see how much air leakage is happening within that closet. They're demonstrated by the red. It was a hot day on a second story where that photo was taken. And we all know that drafts feel uncomfortable. So producing, this is sort of the byproduct, but it's really one of the selling points of Passive House is to let our clients know that you're going to have a much more comfortable building. Along those lines, it's a nice transition to talk about thermal bridging. So the infrared image on the left is showing a second floor attic space. I guess it was actually a hot day that that last infrared image was. This is also the same thing. This is showing where the roof rafters are meeting up with the wall, and that red line there is just showing where we don't have enough insulation at that hip. So you can see again how much heat transfer. It's almost like having a radiator in your home, in those rooms. So that's what we'd like to avoid. The photo on the right, this was classic. Josh was just driving in his neighborhood. He snapped this photo of a frosty morning. You can see every single stud in that house. And so one of the main things that we need to focus on is creating a break, a thermal break between exterior temperatures and interior temperatures to help lock in the energy that we are putting into our houses. Here's a great little slide. It's such a simple tool, but to create a raised heel truss, will eliminate this situation with the radiator at the top of your ceiling, because the image on the right shows that it gives you a little bit more insulation with just a simple technique of raising up your roof where it meets the wall. And again, thermal bridging, we're really always focused on finding the path of heat transfer and eliminating that path, all those pathways. This is a good photo showing exterior insulation. In this case, this is rock wool. The wood here is showing the rain screen, so that's going to go in between the exterior insulation and the siding, whatever siding they're going to use. The blue, I believe, is probably a Henry Blueskin product, so that's showing the airtight layer is happening on the exterior of the building in this case, followed then by the exterior insulation, rain screen, and a typical cladding. And the exterior, as Josh was talking about earlier, the exterior insulation really provides that sweater. And even though wood is not the worst transfer of energy, it's got about R1 per inch, especially when you've got a steel-framed building. You really, when you reduce the energy use of a building as much as we are using in the Passive House standard, you really need to start paying attention to all the places where you're transferring energy in a building, including through your stud wall. So typically you see a lot of exterior insulation happening depending on the climate within a Passive House building. I love this photo. This is a brownstone that's in Brooklyn. The house in the middle brought their home. They retrofitted up to a Passive House standard, and you can see this is a winter day. Check it out. The brownstone directly to the left of the one in the middle is just leaking out all of its heat. And you can see by the one that was retrofitted to the Passive House standard just how much energy they are keeping inside of their building as they heat their building. It's a great shot. It's like basically the same as the car that's off. It's amazing. And I'm going to pass this back over to Josh to talk about the third principle of heat recovery ventilation.
Okay, thanks, Beth. Okay, so we're going to talk about some really exciting stuff here, heat recovery ventilation. This is super important because one of the items that is often heard about airtight buildings is how you need a building to breathe, and that is something that is untrue. People need to breathe. Buildings don't need to breathe, right? So you are creating an airtight layer, but that airtight layer is keeping all that energy in, but oftentimes it is vapor permeable. So I think when people are saying breathe, they're thinking about that vapor. They're trying to avoid the kind of gerbil in a Ziploc bag, not to make kind of a morbid reference, but we want that moisture to be able to transfer through that assembly, or at least escape in one way or another. And the HRV can help with that, right? So people need to breathe, so we need to bring fresh air into these buildings for the people that are living in them, right? So one way to do that would be to simply just cut a hole in the wall. It would let air in, and then we'd be able to breathe. The obvious problem with that is then as soon as you cut a hole in the wall, is all your energy that you were trying to preserve is just going to escape right out. So we need to find a way to bring air in for the people to breathe and still keep the heat inside the building while we're doing that. And that's what the HRV is essentially doing here. So, what we're doing is let's say it's a day like today where it's about 36 degrees outside. Inside our buildings, we're shooting for about 68, 70 degrees. And we want to bring that cold air in. So as this cold air is coming in from the outside, there's some warm air on the inside that's moving out. And that warm air passes alongside the incoming cold air. It doesn't mix, it just passes alongside. So as this cold air is coming in, it gets warmed up by the warm exiting air. By the time that exiting air leaves, it's cooled off, and by the time this incoming air gets into the building, it is warmed up. And so a really nice HRV can capture almost 90, 93 in some cases % of the energy from the interior of the building into that incoming stream of air. So that way we can have that fresh air, and also stay warm inside of our buildings. So we are controlling where we're bringing that air into the house. Similar to our bodies, we don't just kind of bring air in willy-nilly through different parts of our bodies. We have a respiratory system that is dedicated to ventilating our bodies, just like what we're doing here with the house. We have a dedicated spot where we are managing that incoming air into the house, not just letting it leak in and escape from random spots through a defective building envelope or just a lousy build. So that's essentially what an HRV is doing. So what they also do as that air is coming in and out too, it's being run through a filter. Oftentimes these filters can be really aggressive. They can be HEPA filters. They get up to MERV 15 in some cases. And so those filters can take out particles of dust that are actually smaller than smoke dust. So as some of these photos show here, there's a picture of Seattle here a few years back. Same thing happened in Portland. We had lots of wildfires, and it was just brutal outside. I mean, you just couldn't see, a couple blocks in front of you. And you go outside and your lungs just kind of hurt by the end of the day. This was summer 2-3 years ago. But I did get a chance to get into a friend's passive house that day, and you walk in and the air was just sweet. You were like, oh, you breathe in this thing. It was really, really nice. It also takes out particles like pollen. Pollen's actually a fairly large particle, and the filters definitely take that out. So people with allergies or environmental sensitivities living in these homes can make a huge difference. If you're thinking about how much an allergy just affects you, or your kids, if they have to stay home or if they can't get outside or their health is affected by that, getting to work, all those kinds of things can really be mitigated by these filters and these HRVs. So, again, not only bringing in that fresh air for us to breathe, but they're filtering the air and just creating really high indoor air quality inside these buildings, much better than a typical building. In fact, in a passive house, the entire volume of air inside of a building is exchanged once every 3 hours, more or less. So you really are getting a lot of fresh air. As we breathe, we're also letting CO2 out of our bodies, and there's been some great measurements of how much CO2 actually gets caught into a house. You've probably had that experience where you walk into like a sleeping teenager's room in the morning, and it's just, it's brutal. There's just not much oxygen left in that room. I mean, you've also got some stinky socks and whatever that teenager is doing, but a good portion of that is just the CO2 that teenager is emitting. And with the HRV, and you're continuously exchanging that air, you're also letting more oxygen in and getting that CO2 out. And so there's been some kind of anecdotal stories that I've heard of people waking up after living in these buildings and just feeling brighter in the morning and just feeling less kind of hungover-y in the morning because they're just getting more oxygen and less CO2 as they're sleeping throughout the night. So these buildings can actually make you feel brighter and feel better too, which is awesome. Another thing that the HRV does, this is an important part of these buildings, obviously, is that it also deals with moisture control. So to go back to my terrible example of the gerbil in a Ziploc bag, we want to avoid that, right? So it is possible to build a passive house with a vapor impermeable envelope. You just have to manage that moisture we call it from the inside, right? So you want to dry from the interior. And how do you do that? Well, you do it through your HRV in part. And so what happens is if you have warm, moist air on the inside, so take my example of a day like today, inside this building right now, we probably have a 40% relative humidity, whereas outside it's a bright, sunny, cold day. The relative humidity is going to be really low out there. So as you're bringing in that dry air, cold, dry air, and you're taking this warm, moist air, and you're passing it alongside, this warm, moist air is cooling off. As that air with all that moisture in it cools off, that moisture drops out, right? And as it drops out, there's a condensate line which drains that moisture to the outside. So it's drying out the interior of that Ziploc bag with that gerbil in it by letting that warm, moist air cool off and then drop its moisture and running that to the outside, which is keeping the inside of that building at a really nice relative humidity, so you're not getting that moisture happening. So it's another thing that your HRV or ERV is doing. I think we get into the difference of HRV, ERV in a few slides here. If not, I'll come back to it. Another important thing that this unit is doing is that it's balancing the pressure between the inside of the building and the outside of the building. So if you have in your building, say you've got a hood vent, you've got a bath fan, you've got a dryer, a clothes dryer, those things will exhaust a ton of air, 400, 600 CFM. Some hood vents will suck out 600, 800 or more CFM of air. Bath fans, 80, 110, sometimes 150 CFM if you've got multiple bath fans. If you're turning all these things on at once, what you're essentially doing is you're sucking all the air out of the house and you're creating a negative pressure inside that building. And when you do that, air is going to make itself up, right? Everything wants to move from areas of low concentration to high. So air is going to want to move inside that building, and where's it going to come from? Well, as you can see from this slide, it can come from your crawl space, which might have moldy raccoons in it or whatever's in your crawl space. It might come from your garage, which has got your diesel tank in your car and your paint stripper and whatever chemicals you've got out in the garage. You might have that smoky, nasty day in summertime with the forest fires. That smoky air is getting sucked into your house because you're sucking all the air out of the house, or you're blowing all the air out of the house. Industry, pollution, pollen, cats. These are all things that we don't want to get sucked into our building. So what the HRV does is it's always exhausting the exact same amount of air as it's bringing into the house. So you never have any pressure imbalances in your house. So when you have an equal pressure from the inside of the house and the outside of the house, none of these pollutants or nasty things is going to want to infiltrate into your house. Alternatively, you could have pressurized house too. You could have, say, a really windy day. And when wind is blowing along the outside of a house, it creates a positive pressure on the inside of the house. It's actually a negative pressure on the inside. And what that can do is it can take all the heat that you've created in your house and just blow it outside, and it's infiltrating cold air into your house. So by, again, balancing those pressures with your HRV or ERV, you are kind of breaking that, ability for air to want to travel across that, wall. And so they're really making your house, again, not only filtering air, but also not allowing all these nasty things into the house in the first place. And again, if you have a really great air barrier, you have less spots for that air to get in. So we're making it so it's difficult for those nasty things to get in or out. And then we're balancing the pressure, making it very difficult for any sort of transfer to happen, and creating a really nice indoor environment of really high indoor air quality, managing the humidity, and keeping it extremely comfortable. So that is what this machine is doing, allowing us to breathe on top of it and taking care of our stinky teenagers. These are some examples of some commonly used HRVs. On the left, we've got the Lunos ERV. This is just a through-wall unit. It comes in pairs, as one is bringing air in, the other is letting air out. It reverses every so often, and it's just kind of charging a ceramic core. These work great in smaller applications or retrofit applications where they can go through the wall. You can do multiple pairs in a house. Quite efficient recovery. I think they get like 93%. I think these are one of the more efficient ones. In the middle is a Zender. You often see these in Passive House. There's a whole bunch of different ERVs or HRVs that are on the market. The Zender just happens to be very efficient, very quiet, which is, again, something that's really important. When you're building a house with really thick walls and triple pane windows, even small amounts of noise relative to such a quiet house can sound loud. So if you put a loud HRV in a regular house, you might never notice it, but you put that same one in a passive house and suddenly it's like a train going by. Even though the decibels are actually quite low, it's just relative to everything else. So the Zender I've found to be a very quiet machine. Even on boost, you really can't hear the thing. So that's a great thing about those. And on the right, we've got a Panasonic Spot ERV. This kind of looks like a large bath fan, if you can kind of picture that. And it does its work kind of in a cassette up in the ceiling. Nice cost-effective option. And I guess I'll use this opportunity to kind of talk briefly about HRVs and ERVs and the difference. I know there's a lot of confusion about that. Essentially, the difference is the HRV, the heat recovery ventilator, is taking all that moisture and just exiting it out the building and dropping it out through the condensate line. So it tends to lead towards drying of a house. Whereas an ERV returns, as that's going out, it returns some of the moisture back into the building. So if you're in a place with, say, conditioning where you're in, say, Miami or something like that, we have a lot of air conditioning and you're really getting really dry inside your house, you might want to use an ERV and return some of that moisture back into your house so that you're not over drying your house and getting cracked lips and scratchy skin and all the stuff that comes with being dry, throat in the morning. Typically nowadays, our company is using ERVs, even here in Portland, although HRVs can work. I have found some scenarios where the HRV is drying the house out a little more than we'd like. So we've switched to ERVs. That said, the Zender in the middle, you can actually replace the core from an HRV to an ERV, which is really kind of nice. If you find that you've installed an HRV, this happened on a house we built a couple years ago, running a little bit dry, well, we could just simply take out that core and put in an ERV core and boom, and it really kind of helps solve that problem. So that's the main difference between the HRV and the ERV. The ERV lets a little bit of the moisture back into the house to manage your relative humidity so you're not getting too dry. Now we're going to move on to windows and doors. So typically in a passive house, we're using triple pane windows. It's not always necessarily the case. If you're in a climate zone that doesn't require, like again, San Diego, you could probably build a passive house fairly easily with just double pane windows. They have to be really robust and have good spacers and be a nice quality window. But more often than not, and especially here in the Pacific Northwest, because that's really the Passive House Northwest Conference where we're focusing on, it is a triple pane window. And as you can see from this slide here, as you're looking kind of across the the thermal image of the window on the right, you can see how this is a cold day where it's cold on the outside. And slowly, gradually warmer on the inside. And you're not letting any of that blue or green get to the interior where it might cause condensation or problems. And it's also making just more comfortable. You're not getting really cold windows that are radiating cold at you. You're not feeling that. You're actually kind of breaking that, and you can stand next to the window and not lose all your heat to the universe through the window. Yeah, great example of how those windows work there. So here's a quick thing that we did a few years back, just kind of an example of how important windows and doors are. So I'll kind of run you through this here. So what we've done here is kind of taken an imaginary wall and said, okay, this thing's 25 feet long and 8 foot tall. It's got 2 windows and a door. And it's built with 2x6s, and we've got some cellulose insulation in there. It's got just regular framing, not advanced framing, so there's all this thermal bridging happening through those studs. So if we kind of take that R21 cavity insulation and we equal it out with the thermal losses through the bridges and all that stuff, and then taking into account all of our windows, what I've got here is some 0.35 U-value windows, which is, I believe, code minimum, at least in Oregon currently, believe it or not. And you put that into your wall, and it takes that R21 insulation that you're putting in the wall and effectively makes it about an R8.2. So we're saying 20% of this wall is windows and doors. And so that's our effective R value in this example right here. So the question we said is, like, what if we want to use code windows and doors? How do I want to say this? This is an example of a wall where we took that same wall but put in a passive house window and door where it's got a U value of 0.11. And so we said, well, what's the effective R value of this wall? So we did all the calculations, and it turns out that this wall with those passive house windows and doors gives us an effective R value of 13.51, R 13.5. Okay, well, it's kind of, what does that mean? So you went from like an 8 to a 13.5, what does that mean? So we kind of said, well, what if you want to use code level windows and doors in the same wall, but you want to keep that same R value of 13.51, how thick would your wall have to be to get to that R13 with the code level windows and doors? And the answer is it's about 86 inches thick, which happens to be exactly as thick as a Hummer H2. So I have to admit I used a little bit of backwards math here to make it so that it would be exactly 86 inches wide so that it could fit a Hummer H2 in there. But the point being is that what do you want to spend your money on? 86-inch thick studs and that much insulation? Or do you want to invest some money in a higher quality window and door that also doesn't leak and give radiative losses and all that kind of stuff? So I think this is just a really great example. And then we took a kind of a next thing. We were like, well, what if we took code level windows and doors? How thick would a wall have to be to reach R21? Because that's your nominative, your normal value of the insulation, R21. So, okay, let's try to get to R21, put in some code level windows and doors. How thick does that wall have to be? Infinity. It doesn't ever get thick enough to reach R21. So it just really kind of shows through, I think, a really good graphic how important windows and doors are to a building and how much heat loss happens through there. So when you're in a passive house, and this is an example of one where you've got that continuous insulation, you've got some nice windows, you've got an interior of the walls at 77 degrees, your glass surfaces at 79, this must be a summertime day. We're aiming for a condition in these passive house buildings where all surfaces within this building, no matter where you are within 7 degrees of one another. So on this hot summer's day, maybe you might be next to, in the sunbeam in the hottest part of the house, it's 73. Maybe in the back, closet in the basement, it's 66 degrees, So that's pretty awesome. So what's happening here is because that glass is cold with a regular window in a house, your air is kind of moving along. It hits that cold spot. It cools off. As air cools off, it starts dropping down, right? It gets colder air is more dense than warmer air, so it starts falling. And so then it travels along the floor and it kind of warms up and it starts moving up again, and then it moves around, it hits the cold window, and you're creating all these loops of air in your house. These are drafts. And so sometimes you can be next to a cold window and it feels drafty. I've been in lots of homes where it's a single pane glass and you actually realize there's not a lot of air drafting through it, but you're feeling a draft, and what's happening is just that air is cooling off, getting more dense and falling down and creating drafts. So when you have a passive house window, you're breaking that thermal bridge and you're within 7 degrees of anywhere else in the house, you're not getting that air to fall down, and you're not having those drafts happening. So not only are you saving drafts from a really tight window, because these things really oftentimes have 7-point locking hardware with 3 gaskets that kind of lock down into itself, and it's kind of like a submarine door almost. And you're really stopping any leakage coming through it, but you're also stopping that the bridge, that cold that's happening, and stopping this air from creating drafts too. So it's really kind of short-circuiting all these problems. Here's an example of, you've probably seen this condensation on a window. This is a cold winter day. You just took a shower, and all of that condensation just landed on your window, and it can drop down, create mold. You've probably seen this on the aluminum windows where you get all the mold at the bottom of the window, and that's just because you're getting condensation from the warm, moist air on the inside, hitting that cold glass, condensing, turning into water, dripping down, and then becoming mold food, or at least there's food there that the water supports mold growth. On the right, this is actually a picture of my own house. Yep. Someday I will, retrofit this thing to passive house levels if all goes according to my plan. But I woke up one day in winter, and when snow happens or it gets cold outside, it really kind of is an interesting opportunity to see how houses are working or not. This morning I was riding my bike in, and I actually saw some really great examples. It was a frosty morning of roofs that some of them are all frosty and cold, and some of them you can see, a little stripe of where it's all melted because they've got so much heat loss coming through there. In this case, it snowed, and I obviously have a leak happening on the right side there, which is causing the snow to melt out there. So that's, you don't normally see that on a typical day, but you get some snow in the mix, suddenly it's like, oh, yeah, I have some really lousy windows. So I think it's time to move over to, nope, I'm still moving here, sure. All right, cool, I'm gonna keep going. So we're gonna talk about insulation and continuous insulation. So on the picture of the left, here's a house that we showed before with that continuous exterior cork insulation going on. And we also show some sheep here because there is a product, Havelock wool, that is a sheep's wool insulation. So if you want to really lower that embodied carbon and have something that's really resilient, that is an option. So, and kind of fun. So this is a typical infrared image of a wall where we likely have some fiberglass bats in here that weren't installed well. You can see this bay on the left here. Looks like they just kind of missed it about 2 feet from the top of the ceiling right there. You can see the studs through here, the thermal bridging. You can see in the middle there's probably some sort of air drafts that are happening in there. But we want to make sure that when we're building passive houses that we are insulating continuously all the way around this building, but also making sure that we're doing it right. So really testing the quality of your insulation install so that you're not missing any spots like this. Generally speaking, we don't like to see bat insulation. It's rarely installed correctly like you would see in a lab where they do the testing. I know at our firm, and I believe at Beth's firm too, we've just stopped using fiberglass bats altogether. Just because they're just proving to not really work as advertised. Whereas if you use like a blown-in insulation, we'll show a little video of that later on that Scott at Hinge did. In fact, it's the next slide, so we'll show you that. That is really doing some great work with making sure that we're filling in all these voids and not allowing any heat loss through mist insulation. And this is the little video here of some cellulose insulation being installed. And filling up the top and getting all those spots in there. So that's how the cellulose is installed. And you're really not leaving any gaps. It gets behind all the wires and the junction boxes. Looks like there's an outlet on the bottom left there. And really fills in things really well. And this is just a great way to insulate a house properly. Hopefully everyone saw that video. Yeah, okay, cool. So we want to have insulation over the top of the buildings, under the bottoms of the buildings, and the side of the buildings. We really want it around the whole thing. We want to break even below the building, and we have a slide of that coming up, to decouple it from the ground, because you can lose energy to the ground too. This is an example of over-insulation on a roof where this is a zip system product with a Persoco air sealing. That's the pink stuff over the green board. And then on top of that, there's some rock wool insulation, and that rock wool is keeping that zip system board nice and warm so we're not getting condensation from the inside. And then you're seeing some sheathing going over the top of that, creating a vent cavity for ventilation. So insulating over the tops of the buildings, and there's lots of different ways to go about doing this. This is just one example of how you would do it on the roof in a vaulted assembly. I'm happy to take questions, or if anyone will send an email to myself or Beth or Passive House Northwest about assemblies and stuff like that. We can really get into the weeds, but this is just one example right here. This is an example of insulation going under the building. So in this case, we just had a form cut. They'll really cut, this is EPS foam, in this case, expanded polystyrene. Cut to any shape you want, and we simply had them cut it into the shape of a thickened edge slab and set it all up, and we poured the concrete in there, and we've completely decoupled that interior of the house, including that concrete, from the ground. So the insulation is traveling, down the sides and then connecting and under the homes and going back over. So just like with an air barrier, you want to be able to, if you had it in plan on a piece of paper, like put down a pen and be able to draw all the way around the house without ever lifting your pen off the page, right? Do the same thing with your air barrier as you would with your insulation. Make sure that's all continuous. And that would happen very early on in the design stage, which is something that I don't know if we have talked about yet or we will talk about, but making sure that you get into this very early on in the design stage. And also with insulation, I touched on this a little bit. We want to make sure that if we've got a warm inside of a building and a cold exterior, just kind of like we do today, that warm, moist air, you can see that, kind of blue vapor kind of going through there. It just travels right through the drywall, right through that insulation. They're very permeable. And then it hits the back side of that sheathing, which is the least permeable part of this particular insulation. And it goes from like a 6-lane highway down to like 1. And suddenly it's going to start backing up. And if that moisture is backing up at that particular part of the wall, it can, and if it's cold, because it's a cold day outside, it can condense, right? Just like a beer can on a hot summer's day, or sometimes you see like your toilet tank kind of sweating on a hot summer's day, right? It's just warm, moist air is hitting something cold, and it's just turning into water. And so that can happen on the backside of sheathing oftentimes, and this looks like a code level assembly here. So how do you deal with that, right? One thing that should be pointed out with a passive house compared to a typical house is that passive houses use a fraction of the energy of a typical code level house. So the example I give often is that my house, I live in a 1925 Craftsman, and I've got a 140,000 BTU gas furnace in there. That's pretty typical for a house of my size and of its vintage. But the last passive house that we built only needed 4,300 BTU, so 140,000 versus 4,300. That's a remarkable decrease in the amount of energy required to heat and cool this house. But what happens with that, my house is leaky and old, and we're still taking showers. We have house plants. We're cooking pasta. We're creating all this moisture. How come this isn't happening on my house? Why isn't my house rotted out? And the answer is that I've just putting so much energy into the house that it's acting like a kiln. And that huge 140,000 BTUs of energy is drying out any of that condensing moisture on the backside of my sheathing or skip sheathing, whatever is in my house, and keeping it dry, and therefore keeping all these 100-year-old, 125-year-old or older houses from just rotting themselves down. As soon as you lower your energy usage in the houses, which is what the whole goal of what we need to do is, then suddenly it magnifies these issues. You don't have that ability to just dry things out through sheer force. And so we need to make sure and be extra careful, and this is why we computer model these houses, and that's why they're third-party verified during construction to make sure that they're being built exactly per plan so that you don't get issues like this happening because you don't have that force of power to dry things out. So one way we deal with that, oftentimes in our climate with passive house buildings, is that we will use exterior insulation. And you can see from this slide, you've got a warm inside condition, warm and humid. It's cold and dry on the outside. And you've kind of got up on the top, you've got high permeability going through that drywall and through your insulation. Then you get to that blue line, which is your least permeable part of this assembly, where the water vapor really goes from 6 lanes down to 1. Then we've got insulation. On the bottom, you can see a little temperature gradient, and so it's warm on the inside, cold on the outside. As long as we keep that dew point, the point where that water will condense, outside of where our vapor control layer is, that's the least permeable spot. So in other words, we're keeping that least permeable spot warm. We're not going to get condensation. And this is a really important thing. This exterior insulation really keeps your sheathing warm and then keeps that warm, moist air from condensing in that spot and creating all sorts of problems. So that way we can have a wall in a house that uses very low amounts of energy. Again, that 4,300 compared to the 140,000 without running into these issues. We're using exterior insulation to keep that vapor control layer, or the least permeable part of that wall assembly, warm. So this is just kind of saying the same thing right here. So really important thing about insulation, it's also, the insulation is not only keeping us warm, but it's also keeping your building durable and healthy too. So, we talked about all these things, kind of run through. I'll just kind of go through it, and then I'll hand it off to Beth. We talked about airtight construction, which reduces moisture problems, amongst many other things. Get rid of those thermal bridges, so we're not letting energy escape. Heat recovery ventilation, balancing the pressures, allowing fresh air in, allowing, filtering the air, indoor air quality, all that stuff. Using high performance windows and doors, back to that graphic that we did with the Hummer, how important it is to use a really good quality window and door in these buildings, and they keep it from being drafty. And using a lot of insulation, which leads to that good energy efficiency and also keeping your buildings durable and safe and healthy. So that's kind of how one gets to Passive House and kind of the overview of kind of the technology within the envelope of these buildings. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Beth.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
And we're going to sort of speed things up so we can keep things on track. But basically, we've given you the essence of the main components of how to get to Passive House. Let's use building science to our advantage. This is a great example of what happens when you don't have any vapor control layer. You might have ever seen this in a situation before, mold. And importantly, we really need to design for smart buildings, smart assemblies, smart construction. You can do really fantastic design. You can do modern, you can do traditional, you can do all types of vernaculars. We're at the bleeding edge sometimes, as we say. Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. We're at the bleeding edge sometimes. We say we're constantly learning from our mistakes, hopefully not making those mistakes twice. And again, it takes a lot of planning to make sure that we get these things right. This is one of my favorite slides of all time. As Josh mentioned, we do a lot of site-specific work before we even begin construction. We're looking at latitude, longitude, elevation. We're looking at the various trees or building shading on any given site is going to really influence and determine how we're going to place our glazing, for example, on a building, how much insulation we might need. We're also, of course, making sure that we have glazing in appropriate areas. We want to make sure we're not overheating. We want to make sure that we're capturing winter sun to help, in a northern climate at least, to help heat the building. And this is a little image of a solar pathfinder. It's a tool that we use that determines basically where the sun angle is going to be at any given day and point in the year. Of course, it's going to be very different in Fairbanks than it would be down in San Diego. Energy modeling, there's a couple different programs that are out there. Some of you who are already super geeked out into designing these things know about these programs, but they're fairly user-friendly. This one is Woofy. It's open source. Or is this PHPP?
Woofy.
This is Woofy, yeah. There's a lot more that can be said about that. Entire, day-long presentations we could get into Woofy. And then what happens? We build them, we test them, we verify them. We learn from our mistakes. Once again, this is a great example. You can see that these window and door bucks are extending quite a bit beyond the exterior plane of the sheathing, and that's to accommodate the exterior insulation that'll be going on. They've done some pre-planning. You can see the pink around the frames. Looks like it's showing some air sealing that they're anticipating by the time they get to their exterior insulation. And one of the main tools we use to verify a building is by doing blower door tests. So this is an example of what a blower door looks like. The red fabric basically seals off the entryway, and the white circle in the middle toward the bottom is a giant fan that either pressurizes or depressurizes your house. It has multiple rings that you can remove or install depending on how many air changes per hour, how leaky your particular building is, so you can get to an accurate reading. And the tool that she is messing with right now is the mechanism by which we measure the air changes per hour in a house. We take the entire volume of the house, we divide it. We typically pressurize the house to a certain pascal, typically 50 pascals of pressure, which I think is about 20-mile-an-hour winds or something like that, so sort of a typical wind. And then we check for air leakage. And These are some of the common places where you see air leakage: around doors, windows, around mechanical, electrical, plumbing penetrations into your building. And so we're really focused at the, you can see, you can see that she is doing this air barrier test well before sheetrock has gone up, hopefully before insulation has gone up, at a time when you can still have some time to go in and test for air leakage and fix those before you get to your finishes. We like to say that we're building for 7 generations. The project on the right is the orchards at Aranco. That's the project that Josh was mentioning here in Hillsborough. We're seeing a lot of multifamily developments happening with Passive House. And something to note is that, and we'll get to cost here in a moment, but because in multifamily situations you have so much less building envelope compared to, like, say, a single family residence per unit, you can really see the costs of focusing so much on your envelope decrease. So it's a really exciting place. We're seeing a lot of Passive House happening. Durable, long-lasting, beautiful buildings. This is a project by Scott Kosmecki of Hinge Build. This was actually a retrofit. So we can talk next a little bit about, can you retrofit an existing building to Passive House standards? And the answer is yes. And how complicated is it? How much work do you need to do on the house? Can you turn an old jalopy into a fancy new vehicle? It's going to take some work. Retrofits have their challenges. This is a great example of skip sheathing, which we see all around the Portland and Seattle areas. You know, pre-production, mass production of plywood. This is what you see. I've heard a statistic that a typical home of this generation has, on average, about a 3-foot by 3-foot hole if you add up all of the small air leakages in a house. And what we're aiming for typically in a single family residence with Passive House is about a 1-inch by 1-inch hole. So it's a massive reduction in air leakage. And I think, nope, we took off the one that was, oh no, it is showing. So this is just showing how much air leakage is coming in through the skip sheathing in a typical old-fashioned house. You can retrofit, but you really should be taking a building that needs a lot of work if you need to redo siding and windows, because then you can focus on your air barrier. A major renovation or addition is happening. New HVAC systems are required because, again, to retrofit to Passive House standard, you really need a much smaller mechanical system than you would in a typical house. You don't need that giant jet engine gas furnace that you would need because you have such a more efficient house. People always ask about cost. How much does it cost to retrofit? And unfortunately, it just depends. It depends on how old your construction is, how much you were planning to put in. Were you already planning to re-roof your building? Were you already planning to mitigate air leakage in your crawl space or in your basement? So one thing that we don't think about very much in the United States is the upfront cost versus the payback. We often are really looking at how much is it going to cost up front without considering the amount of time it may take to regain those expenses you've put in. And the exciting thing is that because we're on the forefront, we're really going to be seeing costs drop here coming up in the near future as Passive Houses, not Passive House standard, but really high performance building strategies are implemented worldwide. And one thing I'd like to say, speaking of cities, is that United States is not at the forefront of seeing this energy efficiency stuff happen, but we are now recognizing globally that this is really crucial, and this is really crucial to meeting our global warming goals of, like, say, 2030, and to meet these 2030 challenges to reduce carbon emissions. And in China right now, I know that there's at least one entire city that's being built to Passive House standards. So we're going to start to see this really take off quickly and get to critical point here. How much does it cost to build to the Passive House standard? Where are you located? Of course, that depends a lot. what does your architecture look like? Are you building a custom home? Any custom home is going to be expensive. What's your trade base of knowledge? Here, we always say that we have to train our trade partners and our subcontractors to learn about high performance construction. And so once folks are more familiar with what it takes to build to the Passive House standard, they will start charging you less because they're not as scared of it. They are more efficient in their own systems. How big is the size of the building? Again, with like a multifamily type construction, it's a lot less building envelope per square foot of the building, and therefore that proportion of your cost is really going to drop. This is really fun to look at the cost of renewables over time. So this slide is showing, it's a little bit outdated here, 2009 to 2017. It's showing that, the cost of fossil fuels is really kind of just like hanging out there at the bottom. The price is not really changing that much, and all of a sudden here comes solar. 2009, see that blue line dropping out of the left, out of nowhere, bam. It's because solar is not a fossil fuel, it's actually a technology. And as technology improves, the price is going down, down, down. You can see in this slide, 2017, already 3 years ago, is cheaper than the cost of gas, coal, and nuclear already. So it's pretty exciting to see what we can do, what's coming up here with renewables. One thing we did mention in the beginning is we do have 2 certifying bodies. Passive House Northwest is agnostic. We think that both of these certifying bodies do great work. They'll both get you, if your goal for your project is net zero or net positive energy use, both of these certifications will help you to get there. We often say that Passive House is not necessarily the goal in and of itself. It is just the fastest way to get to a net zero, net positive building. We've already discussed, Passive House is being built in schools. It's being built in dormitories. We can see it happening in community centers. I believe that there's a police station, so residential, all types of applications Passive House can be applied to. And again, Passive House, buildings don't need to breathe, people do. So here's just a little bit of FAQs we get a lot of times as people have to really reorient their brain to this new system of thinking. Of course you can open up a door and a window. These are comfortable buildings. They function similarly to any other building that you're used to. And what happens if the electricity goes out? And your HVAC system is not working? Are you going to suffocate in your house? No, because you're smart. You're going to open up the door. You're going to open up the window. You're going to figure that out yourself.
And I should mention too, the HRV does allow for air transfer in
That's
through,
true.
even if
Right.
the power goes out.
Even if the fan is down, right, then there is still transfer happening. Airtight buildings. What about moisture and mold? We've talked a lot about how this type of construction mitigates mold. Design stage, we're really looking at moisture transfer, heat transfer, and how those are going to interact in your building. Again, modeling is super crucial. Continuous ventilation, we have talked about. And temperature variation, we've talked about how comfortable these things are. One thing, the example that I like to use when talking about heat transfer is if you're, say you're with your friends around a bonfire on a cold winter's evening, and you're there, you're warming yourself at the fire, and all of a sudden somebody passes in front of you or stands in front of you, all of a sudden you feel the heat drop off. And it's not because the air temperature in between you and the fire has decreased, it's because of radiant energy. So you're no longer receiving the radiant energy from the fire. So in the same way, when you're in a building that has an even temperature all around it, you're not going to be using your heat to heat the drywall or the window or whatever it is that's sucking your energy out. We've kind of been talking a lot about how you can have lots of different looks to passive houses. Here's a bunch of residential projects, all types of different looks. And educational resources. There's a lot going on with education in the US and in the world. Conferences, obviously. We also have a really fantastic, I'll put a little plug in for the Sustainable Homes Professional course. It's offered here in Portland, Oregon every year through Earth Advantage. It's a 6-month course that'll really get you up to speed on high performance construction, whether you're engineering, architect, whether you're a subcontractor or a trade partner. There are trainings that happen through both FEE and FIAS, the 2 certifying bodies. There's builders training, there's certification, there's all types of trainings that are out there. And here's a couple of really great books that will let you in on some of the building science that we've been discussing here today. We're happy to provide any of these links to you if you don't jot them down here quickly. Again, you can reach out to us personally, and we're happy to talk you through. And that's about it. We're going to wrap up with a big thank you to our sponsors, everybody who's been sponsoring the conference. And
yeah, and I believe we can probably post these up and make them available for people too, the slides.
Slides, we're hoping to, yes. Yeah,
Okay, so yeah, we'll work on that, and that way all these resources and all the stuff will just be available for people to check out at their own leisure.
And are there questions? We have questions?
Feel free. Did we get any yet, Scott? People are madly typing right now. Yeah. So we'll give it a few minutes, see if we get any questions. Obviously, you can send questions to Passive House Northwest, either Beth or myself. We can post our emails, I suppose. If you want to do that, if you have some questions, I'm happy to answer that. And just a huge thanks to everybody. I know this whole goofy virus thing has really thrown a wrench in the works, and so we're doing our best here at Passive House Northwest to get you guys this content. There's going to be a bunch more webinars coming up after this. We'll be recording a bunch of it. So hopefully get this information out there to the world. And a huge thanks again to all of our sponsors here, who really do make this possible. And if you have questions about a lot of this stuff, any of these people at any of these places would be a great resource.
Super knowledgeable.
Yeah, for all this information too. So no other questions. So everyone, we did such a good job.
We've got one question.
We got a couple here.
We've got a couple questions. Great.
Sure. How does one determine when, where an ERV or HRV is most appropriate?
Then repeat the question.
So you want to take it? But
Sure. So there was a question about when does one determine whether one should use an ERV or an HRV. So I think if ever in doubt, go with an ERV. It's still doing a lot of the work. An HRV is going to be just removing more moisture from a building than an ERV would. So in our mixed humid climate here in the Pacific Northwest, the old kind of conventional wisdom was to use an HRV. And I think a lot of people are still doing that successfully.
we are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I really, it depends, why would we use an ERV instead of an HRV? If we know we have a house that say has a vapor impermeable exterior insulation, say something like a foam insulation that's not letting any of the moisture out, we know that we don't have as much resilience, whereas if we use like a cork or a rock wool or some very permeable insulation, we know that the building has the ability to dry inside, outside, through that wall, through that vapor diffusion. But if you have an impermeable exterior insulation, well then you really need to dry to the interior strategy. And so I would say, if you have that drying to the interior strategy, you may want to elect for an HRV to help get some of that moisture out. Right? Let's say you are living in a place that's just experiencing more, moisture, or even if your clients, as you're kind of talking about your build, are really sensitive to really dry air, they might want to have a more moist interior. That might be a reason to go with an ERV over an HRV. But I would really say, our company uses ERVs, Beth's company uses HRVs.
This climate's pretty forgiving.
It's very forgiving in this climate. If you're here in the Pacific Northwest, I really don't think you're going to go wrong. And again, if you're using something like a Zender, you can switch out those cores. They're 4 screws, and you pull the thing out and you slide the new thing in. 4 more screws. Really isn't difficult if you are experiencing some humidity
And can I maybe
problems.
add just a little bit? It depends. somewhat on how leaky your building is. So for example, if we do, say, an addition and we make that air sealed, but the rest of the building is maybe an older home and you're going to see a lot more air changes per hour, that's a situation where you would be putting a lot more energy into the house and therefore you would have a lot more drying effect. So, the lower your air changes per hour, kind of the more that you can get away with just using a simple HRV.
Yeah, hopefully that helps. So.
Claire's asking, there was a photo of a passive house with a wall of windows. How does that work? Doesn't that turn your house into like a big greenhouse?
That's a great question. So the question is, if we have a large bank of windows on a passive house, how can we still meet our comfort standards, it sounds like, and energy efficiency standards? And one of the main answers is that you need to model the house. So we need to make sure that we have adequate shading of any, especially southern, in the northern hemisphere, any southern or westerly glazing to make sure we're not overheating in the summer and to allow for the summer, the winter sun to be able to penetrate in and actually help you out with your heating a little bit. So if you model the house, you're using a really high performing window that's not only maybe triple glazed, but actually has an insulated frame as well, so a completely thermally broken window. You model your house, you can get away with, in certain circumstances, you can get away with quite a bit of glazing. And of course, it's going to be site specific. So if your view is to the north, you're going to have to do some pretty creative thinking around insulation, around orientation of your building, around placing your glazing exactly where you want it to maximize a view without too much energy loss. Again, northern hemisphere is that. That's what I'm speaking of. Anything to add to that?
I think you did a good job. No, yeah, model it and pay attention.
Yeah.
That's all we have so far.
Great.
Okay. Well, we answered all the questions. Yeah. Again, I think maybe we'll wrap it up. Thanks everybody that tuned in and will watch this in the future. Please reach out with questions and please lend your support to Passive House Northwest. We're always looking for new members to help kind of evangelize and get more buildings back to that original slide with how impactful buildings are in fighting the climate crisis and how Passive House can be one of the best tools that we have in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector. So support Passive House Northwest, and thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
All right, thanks, Beth.